This is Dr. Rich Shuttler back with you with lesson number 10 in how to write chapter 4 of your dissertation. This is the final part of a three-part series on presenting quantitative data in your chapter 4. In this lesson specifically, I'm going to address 12 tips and strategies for preparing quantitative data in chapter 4. This is a great lesson to have your pen and paper handy. Take these 12 tips down. If you're designing your chapter 4, make sure you incorporate these ideas and concepts into your work. If you already have chapter 4 drafted, use it as a checklist then. Use these 12 tips and strategies to make sure your chapter is as good as it possibly can be so that you're adding great value not only to the readers who are going to be part of your committee and your university reviewers, but also to those who are going to read your work years from now. As we're working our way through the Chapter 4 lesson strategy, you see we're at lesson number 10 of 12. And after this lesson, there'll be two remaining. One will be on writing the introduction and conclusion sections to your great Chapter 4. And then I'll wrap it up with a chapter wrap-up lesson so that I can cover the salient points, much like reflective learning. In this program in particular, this lesson will address 12 tips and strategies for presenting quantitative data in Chapter 4, and I'll conclude with a reflective summary as I always do. This lesson is 12 tips and strategies for presenting quantitative data in Chapter 4. The first item I want to address is avoiding split tables across pages. Too often, in early drafts of Chapter 4, tables are split. So if you have a lot of information in a table and a table is going to be perhaps at the bottom of one page and carry over to the top of the next page, the APA manual allows you to move the table to the next page. Also know that if the table is bigger than can fit on one page, then you should put it as an appendix. But make sure if you have tables anywhere in your dissertation that they're not split amongst pages. It may seem like the thing to do at the time, but believe me, it's not. Provide enough information to suggest how the hypotheses were tested to achieve results. Remember, in the prior lesson, I gave information about how to allude to the information based on research questions in your quantitative Chapter 4. So you'd give information in regards to a narrative about what the research question is, how it was tested. You'd give the formula that you used. Then you'd have your information inside the formula and another figure, and then have another narrative. Now, this narrative that concludes this section should end with the hypotheses testing outcome. But as you write this entire piece of information for each research question, just be sure you have enough information to suggest how the hypotheses were tested and achieved. The best thing to do is after you write one of your responses, say perhaps research question number 1, send that to your dissertation chair and perhaps committee members and ask them to read it. Ask them if there's enough information in there. Get their help while you're doing it for your first research question, and that way when you're confident that you have all the material for how you wrote about the first research question and how you tested the null hypothesis, then you can just duplicate that and emulate it in the following research questions and null hypothesis testing. Make sure that you fully explain any inconsistencies and comments. Oftentimes, the first-time researcher puts information into their Chapter 4 related to the data, and they may not fully explain any inconsistencies. Let's just say, for example, you did your first round of surveys and you did not get enough of them. You may have run your data to see what was there, and then perhaps you did another round to get more people to do your surveys, and you had more people then involved in the entire survey population. Now, perhaps you ran the data again separately for that second group. If you've done that, and then of course you combined them, that's great. Now, perhaps you did what I had done. I had to collapse my data. I originally started out with 5 Likert type survey detractors in my questions. And through that survey, after I analyzed the data, I didn't find as much information that I needed to be able to make any logical conclusions or recommendations. On the request, and more so at the direction of one of my committee members, I was told to collapse the data for items 1 and 2 and 4 and 5, and then rerun the statistical analysis. This was an inconsistency because it's not what I planned in the proposal. It's not what people most likely do all the time. But it's not uncommon to collapse the data and rerun the statistics to find out what that means. If you do something like that, then you should include in Chapter 4 a brief explanation before you provide all the data on what occurred and why. This is what I refer to as fully explain any inconsistencies in the comments. For the next tip, provide enough information in the chapter conclusion regarding research questions and hypotheses. Now, I'm going to give you a specific lesson next on how to write that introduction and conclusion to Chapter 4, but here, because we're relating information still to quantitative data and how it's presented in Chapter 4, I want to make sure that you understand that in the conclusion section of the chapter, you should give indications in particular to what the research questions were and the hypotheses testing. The conclusion should include information that has a narrative reflective of the testing of the hypothesis. As I mentioned throughout the other two lessons, make sure you structure your chapter around research questions. After all, it's the research questions that were written first, and then the hypotheses, and then the null hypotheses. In all practicality, when you're testing that null hypothesis or hypotheses, you are answering the research question or questions. By answering the research questions, you then are able to give information that's going to perhaps close that gap in the literature or give evidence to the stakeholders who find the problem that they're dealing with on a regular basis, and perhaps you're going to help them understand better the differences between theory and practice. But as you design your chapter, I highly encourage you to structure it around the research questions because that's the most important part. While each point and part of the chapter and all your work is important, the testing of the null hypothesis is one thing, but it's that testing that we need to have to answer the research questions. Justify any adjustments of standard instruments or practices. This is a great opportunity here to also consider the practice that I went through, where I had to collapse the data. Collapsing the data was an adjustment to the standard instrument. Now, you may get into your data analysis, and to be able to present it, you have had to do different things to manipulate the data. That's fine. We're not asking you in Chapter 4 to explain it, but if there are any adjustments to the standard instruments, then go ahead and include that. Most importantly, this information is helpful to the people later who might want to replicate your study or want to see how you did something and perhaps learn from how you did some sort of adjustment to the standard instrument. There are many different things that could happen in research, and they are all real and they're all practical. Don't feel like if you made some adjustment to your survey or you did something that's not common, that it's not okay. In most cases, it's fine. It's great that you have done something because you saw something and you made a critical thinking analysis to discriminate with what you planned and what you did and what should have been done, and you made some adjustments. Just make sure that in your work you write to that so that everybody can understand. I can guarantee you, if you don't indicate why, like I did, why I collapsed the data and gave the rationale for it and then the results of what I did, you will get feedback from your committee members as well as your university, and it could potentially and probably will hold up the approval of your dissertation. The next tip I want to talk about is ensure data analysis is consistent with the research design. Now, granted, in Chapter 4, we're not really analyzing the data, but you're giving enough information to create meaning. Therefore, if you use the correlation design, you're going to write and use certain words that go with correlation design as compared to a causality design. Just make sure that the information is consistent with the research design. When you indicate whether there's a correlation, if any, between the independent variable and the dependent variable, or if there's causation between the variables, that you use the words correctly and you're consistent with the research design. You can be sure that you will get questions in your oral defense related to your research design on why it was appropriate for your study, what and how you applied it to your research data collection, and how it was aligned with the research design in the sense of testing the null hypotheses. And what does that mean when you're answering your research question? You have to be somewhat of a subject matter expert on your research design. By this point, you probably are if you're writing your Chapter 4 now. If you're not writing Chapter 4 now and you're listening to this lesson early so you can be better prepared, first off, fantastic. That's great. You're proactive and you're going to do better than you thought you would otherwise. But it also helps you to prepare and understand when you're writing your research questions and in your proposal how you can make sure that it's consistent throughout all chapters. Make sure in Chapter 4 that you always show the formulas and document their sources. Now, these are one of the few things that you would cite in Chapter 4 in a quantitative study. Whether you're using a chi-square test, a Pearson coefficient, whether you're using a t-test, wherever testing you are going to apply to your data, show the formula and document where you've got that formula. Even if you picked it up through a fair share sample guideline in a textbook, that's fine. We want to make sure that we know where you got your formula. We want to know that you have the right formula, and we want to know where you got it from. This helps other people to replicate your study later, but it also helps us to understand when we look at your chi-square test, the formula, that we're sure it's the correct formula. Tables and figures are self-supported, but they still need a narrative. You cannot have a table or a figure anywhere in your work without having a narrative preceding the table and figure, or preceding, of course, the appendix if you decide to take a table or figure and put it as an appendix. But they should still be self-supporting. So if you have a table that indicates how your mathematical calculations were done, then make sure that you label that table correctly. If you have a figure, for example, a formula for a chi-square test, that you have enough information in the figure caption that provides enough information for what that figure is about, and that within the figure, somebody could see the formula and truly understand everything. You may have to do a little subscripting of the information on what the different mathematical calculations are, and therefore it becomes self-supporting, but you also need to explain it in a narrative that precedes that table or figure. Keep in mind, what you're doing with this table and figure is providing what we call a picture is worth 1,000 words. The reader of your work years from now may never read the narrative. They may just want to go straight to the figure or your table and learn from that. And this is the power of adding value to your work with tables and figures. The next idea or tip, if you will, or strategy for presenting quantitative data in Chapter 4 is there's no statistical calculation errors. You can be sure that if your dissertation or your committee members do not run the statistical analysis based on the numbers that you have, that somebody at your university, the reviewer, would do. There is no reason why there should be a statistical error in the calculations that you do to produce whether you're going to reject or fail to reject the null. An error in mathematical calculations when you're doing the statistical development could mean the difference between what you provide and that rejecting or failing to reject the null being an error. Nobody wants that in your work. So do yourself a favor. Double check all your calculations. Actually, I encourage you to have a peer do it or make sure that your dissertation chair does it, and make sure that everything you do is 100% correct. And if you don't think somebody's going to run the data like you did and at least make the statistical calculations in the formulas, I think you're mistaken, because people will do that. Detail what is nominal and what is ordinal data. As you present information in Chapter 4, as you give information about your demographics and then about your survey outcomes, make sure when you're writing about that that you literally detail what kind of data it is that you're managing at that point. There is different type of data that's provided in a Chapter 4 for a quantitative study, and you want to make sure that you include what kind of data it is. So as you start to give information based on the demographics, indicate that kind of data. As you give the analysis of your statistical development in testing the null hypothesis, make sure again that you indicate what kind of data you have there. This will bring extra value to your work, and it helps the readers to understand that you know the differences and you can distinguish between nominal and ordinal data. Of course, always use research terminology. Research terminology, of course, use it in the way, as I mentioned earlier, that aligns with your research design. Research is an industry in of itself. It's also a body of knowledge. And in research, we have certain terminologies and words within the context like any other industry. If you work in education or healthcare or the government or the military, every industry has unique, specific words that align with the expectations of that industry. Make sure you're using commonly defined terms that align with research methodology and that the terminology used is correct. As always, in Chapter 4, it's about presenting the findings, not explaining the results. You're really not analyzing anything other than enough to give meaning to the testing of the null hypothesis. But you're not going to give any findings in regards to what that means. You're just going to indicate that the testing of the null was either you failed to reject it or you rejected that null. In Chapter 5, that's where you're going to explain the results. You're going to explain what that testing means. You're going to explain how answering the research question provides information that could be used as perhaps recommendations, or how answering that question could infer something to other people to also consider in their need to be able to overcome the problem that you wrote about. Now I want to give you just a couple quick examples from two of my mentees so you can see how they put together their Chapter 4. These examples were provided from my mentees who tend to get their work approved on the first pass. Both of these did, and I'm very proud of the work that they did. They each given me written consent to use their work to help you better see how your work can be designed. I always give, as you see here, the student's name and the year that the student graduated and the name of their dissertation. This way, if you want to go to ProQuest Dissertations and download their dissertations, you can do so. I encourage you, if you do so, send them an email. Let them know the value that their work held for you. Imagine getting the same kind of email for your work in the future. It's a good thing, and it gives credit where credit's due. Now, Dr. Joseph Hagee in 2013, in his dissertation titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a quantitative correlation study, has this as his table of contents. And this is what I wanted to show you in this lesson, that the table of contents, as you see, started on page 87 and ended roughly at page 110. How many pages is that? Exactly, just over 20 pages. You can see how he designed his chapter, and you can also gain a sense that all you're doing is writing about 20 pages for a Chapter 4. Isn't that going to be easy? But also notice how he designed it. First, he gave, right off the beginning, the results. He addressed the reliability and validity of the survey instruments. He addressed the power analysis of the sample size, gave information about the pilot test, how he collected the data, how he analyzed the data, the demographic synopsis, and then leadership practices that he addressed in one page, and then went into research question 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can see for basically each of the research questions are only about 2 or 3 pages each. Not a lot of information is required. And the next item, which is Dr. David Beckett's dissertation, his work was done in 2015. His dissertation is titled Correlation Analysis of Intensive Care Unit High Reliability Leadership Concepts and Hospital-Acquired Infections. In his table of contents, you can see he also started his dissertation right at about page 97, as did the other person. It ended at page 108, or by the time the conclusions were ready at 109. Again, about 22 pages. See how he designed his chapter. Starts out with results, then goes right into population and demographics, the variable structure, data screening, goes into the research questions hypothesis, gives a little bit more information about each, and then goes into research question and the hypothesis 1 through 5. Again, 1 or 2 pages basically for each of those, and the conclusion. Because after all you're doing is giving a little bit of a narrative, giving the formulas, and then giving the information on the testing of the null hypothesis. This doesn't have to be elaborate. Remember, keep it simple, student. In this lesson, I gave 12 tips and strategies for presenting quantitative data in Chapter 4. I believe if you use these 12 tips and strategies as a criteria for double checking your chapter or making sure that your chapter is built in a manner that's going to bring great credit upon you and your university, that you're going to find that your work will be easier to develop. After all, through these 12 lessons, the idea is to give you information on the expectations that are going to be held upon you. The next lesson, which will be lesson number 11 to 12, that's where I'm going to go into providing information about writing the introduction and conclusion sections of Chapter 4. Like every other chapter, these are usually the last two sections to be written, and oftentimes what I find are the least considered by the student where more work is needed. And it's because oftentimes the student believes that the introduction and conclusion sections are not important. They're just as important as every other section. In fact, in some cases, the introduction is so important that if it's not designed well, somebody may never get into reading the rest of your chapter. And it's not uncommon that some people may just go straight to the conclusion because it's like the end of a story. Reading the last chapter of the book, you know exactly what it is about. So I'm going to give some ideas and thoughts about how to write your introduction and conclusion sections in the next lesson. And then the final lesson for this strategy will be an overview of the 12 lessons, just things for you to keep in mind as you're designing your Chapter 4. Chapter 4 should be simple to create. As you saw, many of my mentees did it certainly within 22 pages, and it's not that complex. I'm not going to say that it's easy, but it's simple. You put together the right approach, make sure that the same approach is followed through each part of the research question and the null hypothesis testing with the formulas, and you've got it made. This is Dr. Rich Shuttler, hoping that you're finding this lesson strategy helpful. And if you have any comments or you need a little extra assistance, please go to my website, drrichshuttler.com. And if you're finding value in the lessons or the webinars that I'm doing, please feel free, and I would appreciate it if you would share it with your peers and cohort members. If it can help them to get done a little quicker as well, with a little less stress, then it's worth it. Thank you very much.